The Memory of Love, Chapter 23. A day passed, then another. The clouds hung thick over the city. Only their patterns altered with the wind. It was as if we were trapped on the dark side of a mirror. We could see the world, people running through the rain, children playing in the puddles, but you could not hear them. The house was quiet. One or two of Julius's colleagues from the university called. His absence at a meeting had been noted. We told them he had been called away on a family matter. No news of Kekura. The dancer fellow, I remember, dropped by. Somehow he had heard what had happened, and he arrived, throwing out offers of help, claiming to have various contacts here and there among the police. I did not like his familiarity, the way he sat, legs splayed, arms stretched out along the back of the chair, making a display of himself. Nor did I believe his claims. Were the police taking dancing lessons now? But Safia would take help where she found it. I had a growing sense by then that no good would come of stirring things up. Better to sit it out. And anyway, sure enough, the fellow returned hours later, with nothing to show for his apparent efforts. After the door closed behind him, Safia began to cry. I moved over to sit by her. I put my arm around her. She neither resisted nor made to move away. The sobs came, dry, uneven, causing her shoulders to shudder. Her head rested on my shoulder. From her hair rose a close, earthy scent. A tear landed upon my shirt, and I felt it soak through the cotton and touch my skin. I stayed sitting there as long as I could until I felt the shift in her. Any moment she would regain her composure and perhaps feel awkward with our proximity. I stood up. It will be over soon. There is a procedure for these things. Soon enough we will know. My wife provided the break. She sat up straight, wiped her eyes and blew her nose. Can I fetch you something? I said. Shall we go and get something to eat? No thanks, Elias. I should stay close to the phone. But I'm terribly thirsty. In the kitchen, I opened the fridge door and reached for a bottle of water, but instead took a bottle of Coca-Cola, poured half of it into a glass, along with a slug of Julius's whiskey. I put the glass on the table in front of her. She picked it up and took a sip. What's in there? A little whiskey, I replied, just to calm me. She nodded and took another sip, because to rehearse aloud details from the previous days, starting with the morning after the party. A fingertip searched through her own mind for whatever it was she had missed. Outside the window, the blue of the sea turned gray and then black. In the garden, the colors grew solid and then withdrew. The phone was silent. Between ourselves, little of consequence was said. I refilled Safia's glass. Once, twice, she did not move from her place of the seat. I stepped outside onto the veranda to gaze at the sky. The late blue darkness settling over the city. I lit a cigarette and smoked it in the darkness. Through the glass of her sliding door, I could see Safia. She sat in a coin of bright light from the lamp. Her head rested on her forearm across the back of the seat. I stood and watched. I shrugged my by darkness, she in the light. Something in her pose struck me. The weight of her head where it rested upon her arm. I realized she was asleep, or else on the verge of it. For several minutes, I remained where I was, quite still. I wished I could stay there all night. I let go of my self-imposed restraints and allowed myself to fantasize, to think what it might be like, that this was all mine, my home, lit up against the night, the sleeping woman inside my wife, not sleeping from exhaustion, fear and whiskey, but slumbering in peace. I wish Julius would never come back. The next day, at 11 o'clock in the morning, I was arrested. 2 plainclothes policemen were waiting for me on the stairs outside my apartment. As I returned home, carrying a freshly purchased cake for my breakfast, we drove away through the city, and from the back of the car, I watched people going about their business. Already I envied them, the mundane ritual of their mornings. After a few minutes, the car pulled up outside an unobtrusive single-story building, and I was taken inside. Two men were standing in the lobby. They paused their conversation. Their eyes followed me as I was led by. A remark was exchanged with one of my escorts, something frivolous, followed by a laugh. We passed into a corridor, a series of gray painted doors on either side. One of the doors was open. They pushed me inside. A cell, windowless, apart from a letterbox slit of window, high upper wall. Stains on the wall, the air heavy with the reek of body odor. A desk, a chair, no other furniture. I placed the cake upon the desk and sat down. I waited. I took the time to review my situation calmly. No point panicking. Julius, Yansani, Kekura. No doubt whatsoever I had been arrested in connection with those three. But what were they involved in? And what did I have to do with me? I knew nothing. I would tell that to the police, but would they believe me? It seemed unlikely. Anything could be that simple. With the thought, my heart beat harder. They must believe me. I counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. Outside, the temperature rose, and so did the temperature in the room. I pinched at the cloth of my shirt. I felt sticky. I heard occasional sounds of people passing down the corridor. Nobody stopped. Nobody came to the door. I had been in need of the toilet when I arrived, and as I sat there, the pressure inside my bladder began to mount. I considered my option. I could continue to wait. I could call someone. It occurred to me they had left me without locking the door. I could step outside at any time. Though that seemed somehow reckless. I held on 10 more minutes, then stood up and knocked on the door. I listened. I waited. I rapped again. Footsteps in the corridor. The door opened, and I took a step backwards. A man leaned in, glanced at me, pushed the door fully open, and held it for a second. Man, who stepped into the room. Mr. Cole, please sit down. The man in front of me was short, with very black skin, dressed in a charcoal gray suit with short sleeves and button-down pockets. He was carrying a manila folder. The first man placed a chair inside the door and departed. The second man took the chair and placed it, not opposite me as one might imagine, but on the same side of the desk. When he sat down, our knees and elbows were practically touching. He placed the papers on the desk and folded his hands. I must apologize for having inconvenienced you, Mr. Cole. I know you are a teacher at the university. A lecturer. Of course, he smiled. I hope this will not make you late for classes. I replied that classes were over for the holidays. I relaxed slightly, relieved to hear the civil tone he was taking. I had begun to let my nervous imagination get to me. I smiled back to signal my cooperation. Good, he replied. From his pocket, he drew a pencil and opened the folder. I watched while he wrote my name in capital letters across the top of a piece of paper. At his request, I supplied my address. What is your position at the university? He asked. I'm a lecturer in modern history. And how long have you taught there? I told him. He wrote the information down. He seemed to write at an interminable pace, like a child, copying his letters. If I'm to make a statement, could I perhaps write it? I offered. It's quite all right, Mr. Cole. He glanced up, surveyed me momentarily. I know what I'm doing. Something in the glance, the way he seemed to enjoy enunciating the syllables of my name, stopped me persisting. He added, this is not a formal statement, just some note for my own records. He asked me details about my life, the time I had lived at my present address, my landlady's name, where I had been born and where I had studied, which courses I taught at the university. At the mention of European history, he stopped writing in order to share with me some observations on the Jacobian Wars, in which he claimed to have an interest. Amateur naturally, he smiled. Guy Fawkes, Catholic Spain, the gunpowder plot. He'd become interested after observing the rituals of bonfire night while training in England. I could not see the relevance of any of this to my case. Though, because he seemed friendly enough, I made a pretense of listening and kept my knees pressed together. I yearned for a cigarette, but I had none on me. He resumed writing, broke off again to ask me about the contents of the box on the table. I told him the box contained a cake. His pencil lead broke. He called for a replacement. The minutes ground by. After over an hour, he had still not asked me anything of substance. I knew the time because I glanced at my watch. Without looking up or interrupting his meticulous transcription of my answers, he said, "Do you need to be somewhere?" I replied that I did not. However, I did need to use the bathroom. He continued to write. "I need to use the toilet," I repeated. He looked up at me, appearing to focus like a small creature emerging out of the darkness. "Yes, of course." "Thank you," I stood up. He waved me back down again. "This won't take a minute. Please, Mr. Paul, be patient. As soon as we are done here, I will have somebody show you to the bathroom. You can relax, enjoy some breakfast." He smiled, indicating the cake with a nod. And so it went on. The asking and careful annotating of one banal question after another. I answered as evenly as I could, repeating my answers once, twice, as he struggled to write them down verbatim. Then, without warning, the nature of the questions altered. I had answered a question about which campus activities I supervised. In the same opaque tone, he asked, "Are you aware of any illegal activities taking place on campus?" "What?" I said, "No. I mean, what sort of activity? Students drinking? That happens all the time." "No," he replied. "I'm not talking about drinking." He waved his hand dismissively. "In that case, no. What would you say if I told you the reason you are here is because we believe that you are?" "Well, I would have to say I'm not. I don't even know what you are talking about." "So you deny it?" "No, I'm not denying anything. I'm just saying I don't know." "So you are not denying it then?" He fixed me with a hard stare, at the same time holding up his pencil and giving it a triumphant twirl. He sounded almost cheerful. I wondered if, in his word, this was what passed for a sense of humor. "I'm simply saying I don't know." The words came out louder than I had intended. I was frustrated and amused by this petty wordplay. I could feel the beginning of a headache. I watched as he added my most recent words to the bottom of my lengthy and growing statement. He was either an idiot or he was amusing himself with this pretense of being a bone-headed policeman. I suspected the latter. "May I ask what this is about?" I said presently. He looked at me for several moments and blinked as if trying to make sense of the string of sounds I had just uttered. "What this is about?" he repeated. "Yes," I retorted somewhat tersely. "Why am I here?" "Well," he said, "I cannot tell you. At this time, we do not know whether you have any information, so we cannot say." He was at it again. I said, "You are saying you don't know what this is about?" "We are making inquiries, you understand." "You must know why you are making inquiries." I tried to maintain my composure, but the obtuseness was grating on me. I smiled to hide my anger. He smiled back at me. There followed a deadly silence. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I'm sure you have nothing to fear. Please let us continue." He bent to his paper, as if reading the next question from it. "You are a friend of Dr. Kamara." "Which Dr. Kamara?" Pathetic, but I couldn't help myself. "Dr. Julius Kamara. He teaches engineering. I'm told he is a friend of yours." "I know him, yes." I crossed my legs. He asked about Julius. How long had I known him? Who were Julius's other friends? What might I know of Julius's background? I resisted any further temptation to parry with him, keeping my answers to a minimum, not least because of the intense pressure in my abdomen. "Dr. Mara uses your study at the university." "From time to time, yes." "How often?" "Not often. Once a week, twice a week." "Once a week, no more." "And when was the last occasion you allowed him to use your study?" "I can't recall exactly," I said. I knew precisely. It was the day I had gone to see Safia, though I recalled neither the day nor the date. I had them written down in my notebook. This week, last week, during the exams, I believe. The dean knows all about this. He was perfectly happy with the arrangement. There's a shortage of space for faculty on campus. He nodded and looked at me, a long considered gaze before applying his pencil to the pad once more. With sudden desperation, I said, if I could use the toilet before we continue. Nothing save the scratch of pencil upon paper. Perhaps I could have your name. He looked up. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, I'm happy to help you in any way I can, but I would like to use the facilities before we continue. He put down his pencil. The problem is this, he explained slowly, as if he was talking to a moron. The toilets on this floor are reserved for staff use. Somebody will have to take you to the correct floor to use the ones there. Perhaps then I could have your permission to use the staff toilets? He stared at me before replying deadpan. I'm afraid I do not have the authority to allow that. It is better we continue here. He tapped the paper with the end of his pencil. And finished. Then you can go. He continued to gaze at me. The man was a small-time sadist. Pedantry, his weapon of choice. I felt a trickle of rage in my belly. I wanted to hit him. For an hour more, he questioned me. I hid nothing. I had nothing to hide. Eventually, he put away his pencil and his notes, opened the door and called somebody. I was led to the toilet. The junior officer who accompanied me insisted that the cubicle door remain open. I turned my back on him, unzipped my fly and urinated. I had held on so long there was much pain as relief in the act. At first, the piece was slow in coming. When it hit the bowl, it was lurid and evil-smelling. I was shown back to the same room, which was empty. No sign of Johnson, of his papers, or my cake. Am I free to go? I asked. 1 minute, please. My guard trundled off. I waited. A long minute passed. The air in the room was hot now, and smell of sweet was my own. I could have removed my jacket, but I chose not to, for to do so felt like some sort of submission. Neither did I sit down again. I walked about a bit, as much as I could in the confined space. The room was 5 paces long, 4 paces wide. Half hour must have passed before Johnson reappeared. At the sight of him, I felt a cold gust of anger. I said, are we through yet? Oh yes, his manner was amiable. I was in no mood for it. Am I then free to go? Yes, there are 1 or 2 formalities to attend to. Forgive me if I delay you a few minutes. Father, none of it should take long. You did say you were not teaching today. He was amusing himself at my expense. Do sit. I'm perfectly fine as I am, thank you. You will be more comfortable if you sit. I didn't move, but remained standing in the same spot. Johnson, too, stayed where he was, arms folded in front of him, and watched me. The seconds ticked past. I could hear the sound of rain, a rushing in the distance, ponderous drops from the eaves of the building and from tree branches. I was aware of Johnson's eyes upon me, regarding me as though I was a querulous child. I felt petulant and aggrieved. My heart ached and I experienced a strange and sudden urge to cry. He had even stolen my cake. Johnson cleared his throat. You will be more comfortable if you sit. I was about to decline a second time when I changed my mind, seeing how absurdly I was behaving. I was only delaying my own departure. Fine. I walked across the room, seized a chair and dragged it into the middle of the floor. I sat down. Johnson crossed to the door. Be assured I'll try not to keep you waiting any longer than necessary. Mr. Cole, just a few minutes. He smiled minimally, and as he left the room, he turned the key in the lock behind him. I had been wrong about Johnson. There was nothing civil about him at all. I waited outside. The rain eased off, slowing to a distant patter. I listened to the drip, drip of the runoff from the roof. I sat for an hour or so in the failing light until, without warning, the overhead light went on. A switch on the other side of the door. I called out, but nobody answered. A numbness was spreading across my buttocks. The heat had gone from the day, and the room seemed suddenly cold. I stood up. I went to the door and banged. I counted to 5. I banged again. Nothing.